In the previous video, we saw that Jesus referred to himself as a third person. In this video, we will look at how the Gospel's viewpoint differs from mythology. In mythology, there are no gods or goddesses or demigods who try to persuade anyone who didn't believe the deity of each god, continuously persuading them to make them believe his or her identity. Strangely enough, all the people in the story who encounter each main character of the mythology knew already that the deity of the demigods, and accepted it as a fact without raising any questions. And also there is no male gods, goddesses, or demigods who mention his or her faithful death and resurrection prior to the event, and approaches his or her followers cautiously, understanding in advance the different tendencies of each person around him. Of course, I'm not saying there is no male god or goddesses who prophesy his or her future event at all. Like I mentioned earlier, whenever they say about the future event, whether that is a death and resurrection, everyone surrounding him or her didn't show any doubt. No confused reactions were recorded. For example, in Greek mythology, in the story of Hercules, there are many male gods in Greek, and Zeus is not the only male god. In Korean translation, we call him Zeus, but in English pronunciation is Zeus, I guess. Anyway, in Greek mythology, Zeus is not the only male god who used to have a sexual intercourse with a human female. Then how could anyone in the story recognize him as a son of Zeus? But all the people in the story believed him as a son of Zeus, without having any doubt. That is odd reaction. When it comes to the point of view of each character of the contemporary mythology at the time of Jesus, it seems to me all the people in the story shares only one single point of view. That exactly belongs to one author alone. In my book, when I analyze the four canonical Gospels, I continuously mention those differences between the story of Jesus and contemporary mythology. In John's memory, it was the first time for Jewish people heard from Jesus' new interpretation of the Messiah in his own perspective. That interpretation eventually became the doctrine of Christianity. Although there are many quotes from the future Messiah in the Bible, but the clear Christian doctrine had not yet been fully established in the form of a written record. Because of that, Jesus had to interpret the identity and the role of the Messiah prophesied in the Bible in his own way. Regardless of their unbelief, he kept trying to persuade them who the Christ was and what was his role to fulfill the prophecy in the Bible. Those two important Jewish messianic prophecies he interprets in his own way, sometimes ambiguously referring to the third-person singular pronoun he, and at the same time first-person singular pronoun I, exactly refer to Jesus himself. There are multiple perspectives in the Gospel story. If I compare it to the movies, there are many people who are holding a camera in the Gospel. So even though it is a documented story passed down to us numerous generations, I can still feel the physical and psychological distance between the eyewitnesses and Jesus. When it comes to the story of Hercules, each person was acting like they accepted his identity as a son of Zeus as global truth. They believed his deity, not having any doubts. That is not the general human reaction. But in four canonical Gospels, as a Christian, even though it is somewhat disturbing to read, the reaction of the unbelievers, that reaction is quite realistic. The major difference between the Gospel of Jesus and contemporary mythology was that realistic reaction of the people. The Gospel writers wrote down the fierce criticism from non-believers against Jesus, and Jesus, instead of cursing them, he tried to discuss with them as much as possible and made a great effort to persuade them. And at the same time, he taught his own disciples to follow his own path. He said that they are also going to stand in front of the people and have to testify about the gospel. He not only experienced the criticism against him, but also he worried about the opposition against his own disciples, and gave a promise that the Holy Spirit will speak through them. That is the commonly accepted realistic reaction of a person who heard unbelievable stories. I'm going to emphasize those facts later again and again. After finishing comparative analysis of the conversations and the relationships of each people in various situations and places in the four canonical Gospels, I was able to realize that the eyewitnesses in the Gospels were very close to Jesus. One of them clearly someone who was very close to him. He even remembered Jesus' speech habits. And also he remembered that one day the Jewish people came to Jesus and asked him to clarify his claims about himself. I said that there was a consistent evidence within the Gospels, enough for us to think that the testimony in the Gospel, it was written by a very close disciples of Jesus, especially the Gospel of John. If John or any other disciples of Jesus testified and recorded in a written form, indicating that one day Jewish people came to him and questioned him in detail because they were confused by his claims on his identity, because he constantly switched between third person and first person singular pronouns as he spoke to them. If there was any disciples of Jesus who wrote it down to make us understand his habit of speech, even in John's Gospel, since there are more repetitions of teachings of Jesus related with his own identity. If so, we could at least assume that the author made an effort to persuade the readers to recognize speech habits of Jesus. But there is no such passage in the Gospel for us to recognize the strange speech habits of Jesus. Maybe it's not that important, but the way he used to say to others had a clear purpose. Because of that, we have to think about that purpose. 12 disciples of Jesus had no such intention of letting us know the strange speech habits of Jesus, because in their own thoughts, that speech habits of Jesus are not that important to them. If anything, it only added to the confusion among Jewish people, both for modern-day readers like us. That aspect of Jesus is much more important clue for us to analyze how close a relationship did they have between the eyewitnesses of the Gospel writers and Jesus. We all know that only those people who are having very close relationships with someone know the private information and even strange speech habits of someone. Without any intention of explanation to the reader, John wrote down even speech habits of Jesus. That fact is important. He unconsciously wrote down the dialogue in his memory between Jesus and the people who were very close to him. Those distinctive aspects doesn't exist in the contemporary mythology. In mythology, whenever a specific event occurs or information is given to the reader, all the characters in the book act with full knowledge of the main character's situation and cooperate with each other harmoniously. All the characters in the book have a single point of view. That means the point of view of each character in the story was not separated. Each people share only one point of view. That is the exact point of view author of the book already had. Because of that, while you are reading an ancient mythology, you don't have to have many questions about it. The author's point of view, and the main character's point of view, and the rest of the character's point of view in the book, and even the reader's point of view are all the same. But the story of Jesus in the Gospel is quite different from the contemporary mythology. The point of view of Jesus is different from the author. For example, why the disciples of Jesus let Judas go, even though Jesus exposed the identity of the betrayer. And why did Judas commit suicide? Why did Judas and the priests decide to arrest Jesus on the Passover day, since they clearly said that it was not the right time for them to arrest him for fear of the insurrection? No one explains it, but when an unexpected turn of events started to unfold, all the events took place according to the way Jesus prophesied beforehand. The reason I said that the perspective of the Gospel is separated other than the perspective in mythology is this. There are various authors' points of view in the Gospel. The reason I said various authors means multiple eyewitnesses help each other to finish the whole testimony of the life of Jesus. There is a major point of view, seeing Jesus as a third person, but at the same time, there is a more closer perspective exists. Definitely belong to one of the disciples of Jesus. Jesus used to teach his own disciples in private place. When it comes to the perspective of the disciples of Jesus, Even though there is a clear sign that the point of view definitely belongs to one of the 12 disciples of Jesus, he acted like a person who didn't know exactly what's going to happen in the near future, especially when Jesus was betrayed by Judas. That separated point of view became more clear in the testimony. There is an author's point of view in the Gospels who gives precise information while describing directly from his own memory, knowing all the conclusions of the story. Because of that, he explained everything to the readers, not to make us misunderstand the whole situation, but at the same time, another point of view that definitely belonged to the same author, but is still living in the memory of his own past, trapped inside that timeline, totally unaware of the gruesome future events was waiting for them. He was embarrassed, didn't know how to react to the situation appropriately. Eventually, he lost the chance to save Jesus and failed to rescue him and his whole group. Considering the information that the author of the Gospel gave us to understand the whole situation, his behavior was somewhat questionable from our point of view, especially at the time of the betrayal. The eyewitness, and as an author of the Gospel at the same time, he recorded the action and dialogue between Jesus and his disciples, including Judas, but the one who documented all of the scene didn't fully describe the clear motive of each person, especially Judas, the betrayer. That fact gives us a clue that the eyewitness, while he was describing the whole situation from his own memory, but he didn't have any full knowledge of the motive of the betrayer. The reason I said they didn't fully understand the motive of the Judas is this. To say that he stole the money and bought some of the land for himself cannot be the clear motive why he betrayed Jesus. It just showed and reflected his cunning nature as a betrayer, but not the direct motive why he betrayed Jesus. Like I mentioned in the previous video, he wanted to avoid execution and political punishment from the Jewish or Roman authority when Jesus was arrested. Since Jesus continuously mentioned he's going to be handed over to the authority and be killed by them. Because of that, Judas wanted to stay away from Jesus as much as possible. But he is already a well-known person to the Jewish authority as one of the disciples of Jesus. That's why he had to publicly cooperate with the Jewish authority, but secretly at the same time. Because of that, from the reader's point of view, it is somewhat frustrating and confusing why the eyewitness and the author of the gospel at the same time didn't act according to the information he already mentioned in the document. Even though the author gives the reader precise information, but each individual inside the story didn't act properly. Especially in the Gospel of John. John remembered he once asked Jesus who was going to betray him. And Jesus gave Judas bread. He pinpointed exactly one of his own disciples who was a betrayer, Judas, with a friendly gesture. But ironically, he allowed him to go and let him do what he had to do quickly. Why? Why his action is somewhat contradicting from our point of view. If he directly pinpointed one of his disciples as a betrayer, he had to stop him doing something, not allow him to do it. But after Jesus clearly answered the John's request by giving bread to Judas, but ironically at the same time allowed him to do something, what he is about to do, and said it quickly. Because of that, John and Peter and the rest of the disciples of him didn't think what he meant to say to Judas was a betrayer. Even one of the disciples who asked Jesus to reveal the identity of his betrayer didn't explain the reason why Jesus said that way. Why did he let him go and said to Judas do something quickly instead of saying, "This one is a betrayer," with a loud and angry voice? Because of that, John and the rest of the disciples of Jesus thought that it was a good thing what Jesus ordered him to do on that night. In order to understand that scene, we have to understand the trusted relationship Jesus had with Judas. What did Judas usually do during the Passover period? Whenever Judas went outside at night after having a conversation with Jesus, he used to go to the poor and gave them some food, or buying something for the rest of the disciples and came back. He was a right-hand man of Jesus, who generously gave food for the poor. That's why Judas once shouted at Mary, scolding her harshly in front of the people, when she poured expensive oil on the feet of Jesus, thinking Jesus would agree with him. But Jesus understood Mary and criticized his own disciples. Even though outwardly Judas followed the teachings of Jesus, but at the same time he secretly stole the money from him to buy his own land. In my book, I heavily criticize the Korean pastors because what they do is the exact same thing what Jewish leaders and Judas Iscariot were doing at the time of Jesus. Anyway, when Judas Iscariot left the dinner table, no one caught him immediately. No one, even the eyewitness and one of the 12 and the author of the gospel, didn't know why. Judas went outside and immediately met the priest and decided to hand over Jesus to the Jewish authority. This is the reason why I said there was a two perspective exist separate from each other. The one who recalled the whole memory of his own, who is the major eyewitness, described the whole story from the start to the finish and gave precise information to the readers. But another perspective exists. It is the perspective of his own, like I said. But that perspective belongs to the one in his own memory, still remained in the past memory. He didn't know what's going on at the moment. Because of that, he didn't know how to properly react to the situation. While we are reading the gospel, we sometimes think that if I were one of them, I would act differently. Because with all the information given to us, we think we can make better decisions than the disciples of Jesus. In mythology, when certain information given to the main character of the story, all the people inside the story cooperate with each other harmoniously, like I previously mentioned. Because of that, we don't see any contradicting action. Everyone is cooperating with each other, but that is not reality. Even though there are some contradicting testimony within the gospel, those are the true eyewitness testimony reflecting our lives. The reason why I believe that the gospel of Jesus is true is not solely based on the fact that the archaeological analysis confirmed the time gap between the exact time when the documents were written down and the events that took place is relatively narrower than any other mythology and historical documents of that time. For me, in the four canonical Gospels, there are multiple eyewitness point of view still remained. In the next video, I will interpret the Gospels from the perspective of Jesus much more precisely, how he reflected the mind of each person who close to him. He dealt with individual person differently. In this video, I introduce some of the contents of my books. This is the main theme of my book. Thanks for listening.